Hi, everybody. Welcome to the March 9th, 2022 meeting of the Finance Committee. In keeping with an act relative to extending certain COVID-19 measures adopted during the state of emergency, as amended by Governor Baker on February 12th, 2022, this meeting will be conducted remotely over Zoom. Attendance by board commission members will be remote, and remote attendance shall count towards quorum. The meeting will be broadcast live and recorded on ECAD. As Connor suggested, I'm going to go through and just do a quick ask. Can everyone state their full name to show their participation? And I'm just going to go down a list, and then I'll keep that list as theoretically our voting list. And so I'm just going to use the panelist list to use this. So Brian.
Brian DiNardo.
Jay.
John J. Olson.
Robert.
Robert Jenkins, present.
Christina.
Christina DiNapoli.
Shireen.
Shireen Diaz, present.
And Timothy.
Timothy Vamosi, present.
And then Patrick Helen is also present. Okay.
Patrick, Kelly's here.
Oh, Kelly came in.
Yeah, attendees.
I'm promoting you right now, Kelly. Sorry, I was on the wrong screen. Hey, Kelly. Kelly, once your audio loads, could you state your full name to recognize that you are here?
Sure, Kelly Lamb.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone.
Look at that, 8 of 9. Typical Mike, always the last one. All right, so with that, let's kick this off. So obviously the goal tonight is relatively straightforward, right? We've got some administrative stuff we're going to take care of in the latter half. While we have Connor and Wendy on, we're going to use the initial part of the meeting to do some administrative or the administrator's presentation of the current status of the budget. I also did send on some materials earlier in the week about the upcoming potential for a training workshop, which essentially lays out exactly what the budgetary expectations are and how the town's budgets work, as well as the Finance Committee rules and regulations, for lack of a better term, et cetera. So in speaking to Connor about this, the goal was we obviously have this prelim budget. We'll have Connor go through his initial presentation on that. If there's questions or if there's anything that's unclear, both Connor and Wendy are obviously here to dive into that as the respective experts in their areas. And then that also opens up the door to having a conversation about any of those pieces of that presentation that are unclear. Once that is wrapped, I'm going to have a quick call out about potentially scheduling, or all of us having the option to then schedule our department outreach, which if there's any questions about that, myself, Connor, we can answer some of those. And then we'll let these people get on with their night, and we'll finish with the meeting minutes and any community member comments, as well as finalizing any training options. Are there any questions or anything unclear before we jump in? Okay. Connor, with that, I'll hand it over to you. I think I'll give you the floor.
Thanks, Patrick, and nice to see everyone here tonight. Thank you for your time. I think everyone here has met me at this point. I'm Connor Reed. I'm the town administrator here in Easton, and this point of the year is the first cut of the budget for the forthcoming fiscal year starting July 1. I presented this to the select board on February 28th, and I'm making the rounds now, and I'm happy to share it. So let me get a screen share going here. If anyone has questions as I go through this, I'll try to move quickly because it's based off the memo you've already received, but please feel free to interrupt me and ask as we go. Everyone can see this okay? Great. So hard to believe this will be the third annual budget cycle and annual budget itself since COVID began. Fiscal 21, which was the most recent fiscal year, ended last June, closed on a positive note financially, with various one-time factors creating an all-time high free cash and reserve balance. Fiscal 22, the current year we're in, that budget took the first steps towards what will be a long recovery from a deeply regressive set of budget cuts we enacted back in fiscal 21. Those steps have moved forward positively. We've been able to restore some positions, but not all. Our staff levels are still well below pre-COVID norms. And so our work remains unfinished there. Moving into fiscal 23, for those of you who've been around longer, unfortunately, you're going to hear a lot of the same challenges we've all been grappling with for quite some time. Most particularly and significantly, the chronic underfunding of state revenue to Easton and what that does to our ability to meet service needs in fiscal 23 and moving forward. So where we are right now in the net is that we have preliminary revenue projected at 96.385 million, with preliminary expenditures from all departments projected at 97.5, yielding a deficit of about 1.1 million, which is relatively typical for the first budget iteration. So I'm going to walk through our revenue profile and spend most of my presentation tonight talking about revenue, because at this stage in the budget process, the expenses are not fully finalized and there's a lot of fixed costs that are major budget drivers that we don't know yet, but we'll come to find out in the coming weeks and months. So moving from the largest source of our revenue to the smallest, as you can see from this chart, and as is probably no surprise to anyone here, taxation is the largest source of revenue to the town of Easton. It composes a full 3/4 of each dollar that the town receives. On the right hand side, you'll see a simple chart showing in the past 5 years that as time progresses, the percentage of our total revenue portfolio that is composed of taxation continues to grow. It was below 72% in fiscal 19, which is not all that long ago, and it is now 75%. There's a variety of reasons for this. One is just the compounding interest effect of Prop 2.5, but a major driver of this is that the second largest source of our revenue, which is state aid, you see here in orange, is now dropping to 15% or less of our revenue, when before the 2008 financial crisis, it was more than a quarter. So as we move into, I think there's a hand raised.
Sure, Connor, just a question. In regards to the state contribution to the town of Easton, is that a formula based?
It is. So there are two main components. So it's a good segue because we're heading into that area now. So state aid to Easton is our second largest revenue category. It is incredibly significant because of that. And it's roughly $13.2 million is the projection next year. It is overwhelmingly composed of two specific revenue categories. One is Chapter 70 education aid, which is funded based on a formula that looks at a variety of demographic and economic figures, student enrollment, relative wealth of the community, property values, things of that nature, and it's a formula. And then the second is unrestricted general government aid. And that is done typically through basically a consensus revenue share forecast. So unrestricted general government aid is roughly 2 million and change, and that is increased each year, usually at the rate of increase of the state's tax increases. So the biggest driver there, Chapter 70, which is education aid, that's 10 million of our 13 million, that is entirely formula driven. And I'm going to get into some of the weeds on that now. So next year, fiscal 23, state aid to Easton is projected at just over $13 million. This is an increase of only 1% from the current fiscal year. I don't need to remind anyone of what's going on with the CPI. That's just completely not adequate. It is the second largest source of our funds. It has, due to these funding formulas, been underfunded for 15 years, resulting in a growing shift of the town's financial reliance onto local taxes just to keep our eyes above water, which creates the kind of frustrating dynamic for taxpayers where every year they see their tax bill increase, yet they're not necessarily seeing tons of new programs or positions added. And they're saying, well, if my taxes are going up, why is the town having a hard time balancing the budget? It's because as time moves on, we get these 1% or less increases in state aid, which simply do not keep pace with any type of expense, and we need to lean more heavily on taxation. As I mentioned before, state aid use. Yep.
Can I ask a question? So is the decrease we're seeing in state aid largely Chapter 70 decrease, and what changed?
It's both. Chapter 70 is the bigger problem because it is inflexible. And nothing has changed since 2008 materially there. The problem is that it just over time, you have the compounding effect where annual increases of 1% or less just get completely outstripped by everything else, resulting in it creating a smaller portion of your revenue portfolio. And I'm going to get into the history of that a little bit more because it's a good question. Unlike local taxes, which are capped by Prop 2.5, so despite what's going on in the economy, for better or for worse, our tax collections grow by a reasonably comparable amount every year. But state tax collections in Massachusetts have exploded during the pandemic and recovery from there. The state tax revenue has grown by almost 30% in the past 2 years. Despite this, that type of revenue sharing that I mentioned for unrestricted government aid is not currently what we are seeing in the governor's proposed budget. The state aid formulas I'm going to cover in these next slide pose the largest long-term risk to Easton's financial health and operational capacity. So getting to a couple of the good questions we've had, Chapter 70 education funding. So this is a really big ticket one, and Dr. Cabral covers this a lot in her budget and staff presentations. So Chapter 70 education aid is a formulaic funding bucket from the Commonwealth that is the largest source of state revenue we receive. It's projected at 10.35 million in fiscal 23. It's an increase of less than 1%. There's a reason for this. Easton is called a minimum aid community. We are one of 135 school districts in Massachusetts. So just over 1/3 of schools in Massachusetts fall into this category. That for a variety of the formulaic reasons based on income and other factors I mentioned before, the formula basically determines that the state's obligation to increase education spending is what's called minimum aid. And so regardless of how much increased funding is provided to the Chapter 70 program on the statewide level, minimum aid communities get the minimum allowed by law, which is $30 per student. So $30 new per child in a school system that costs $45 million to operate. This basically results in a roughly $100,000 increase in education funding for the state each year, which is less than 1/4% of the cost of operating that school. So of all committees, everyone here knows that that is simply not a sustainable amount of revenue increase to continue maintaining level services. There was a lot of press coverage in recent years of education reform in Massachusetts. It was called the Student Opportunity Act, and it has led to a significant increase in statewide Chapter 70 spending, which is laudable. However, this doesn't apply to minimum aid districts. And so when you look down at these next few figures, the governor's proposal for fiscal 23 increases education spending on the state level by nearly $500 million, almost 9% year over year, which is great. However, only 9 million of that $500 million, so that's 2% of that increased spending, will flow to the minimum aid communities. So the result is that on average, minimum aid districts like Easton will see an increase of less than 1%, while the other 2/3 of districts will see closer to an 11.25%. So that's the Chapter 70 challenge that we are dealing with. The second major part of state revenue that's really important is what's called unrestricted general government aid, or UGA. This used to be known as lottery aid. This money is primarily or ostensibly used to flow from the lottery in Massachusetts. It used to be called lottery aid and grew more regularly. And then during the 2008 recession era, that was renamed and it was cut dramatically. And it moving forward under Governor Baker, there's been a kind of revenue share team-based approach where the Commonwealth says, well, whatever we are projecting our revenues to grow by next year is what we're going to grow your unrestricted aid by. And what this chart on the right shows, this is from the Massachusetts Municipal Association, is that since 2015 through 2020, the green line there is state revenue growth year over year, and the red line is UGA growth year over year. There was a couple minor deviations in there, but mostly we were on target. However, since the pandemic era of budgeting, what has happened is that the state is using revised estimated revenues based on current collections. So they're setting a benchmark here in the budget process saying we think we'll bring in $10. Halfway through the year, they say we are clearly going to bring in 15. So they revise retroactively that benchmark and then forecast a modest bump. So we're basically getting that growth netted out and not flowing to municipal governments. So What that means is in the 23 budget proposal, there is only a 2.7% increase proposed for unrestricted government aid. That's for every city and town in Massachusetts. So the backdrop here is that during a time when state revenue has grown by nearly 30%, UGA will grow by about 6%. So we're losing out on an enormous percentage here. And what that translates to Easton, had Easton's UGA grown consistent with past practice and the state's own revenue growth, we'd be about $500,000 to the better. As we started this presentation with, that's almost half of the entire deficit we're proposing right now. That's numerous public jobs, that's numerous programs worth of funding. And because of the way that these formulas typically work, that's your new basis for future growth and for future incremental adjustments. And so if you lose this in a year like this, you're very unlikely to get it back. So unless the Massachusetts legislature, through their own budget iteration process, amends this account, Easton will see only $65,000 of new revenue from UGA rather than a roughly $500,000, which is what it would be were it consistent with past practice. This is something that the Mass Municipal Association is raising at every opportunity they get. The Finance Committee should have been copied on a memo that was submitted by the town to our legislative delegation and the chairs of the House and Senate Ways and Means Committee. They are having a hearing on local aid March 15th, where this issue will be raised, not just from Easton's perspective, but most municipalities in Massachusetts, where we're effectively asking, we do not want more than our fair share, but we would at least like to be closer to whole because these opportunities, hopefully there's nothing like COVID ever again that creates this strange economic dynamic we're in, where you see something like Massachusetts tax revenues grow by 30% in a couple of years. So we'll stay tuned on that and see if in future editions of the state budget, as they go through their process, they move that closer to whole. And if they do, we will of course revise our budget forecast accordingly. The net of all that kind of jargony mess of state funding formulas and history is this has created and is the #1 contributor to the structural revenue deficit that we deal with every single year. The longer you're on the Finance Committee, the more tired you're going to grow of hearing me use that phrase. The chart here on the right shows the effects of the recession and then the COVID recession, where without even adjusting for inflation, just looking at raw dollars, net state aid available to Easton has grown by less than $1 million in 15 years. Our budget's nearing $100 million per year. So this is our second largest and therefore second most important source of revenue. And it has grown by less than $1 million in 15 years. Our tax levy goes up multiple million every year. So you can see that as time goes on, this will just compound and this dynamic will worsen unless there are significant changes in the state funding formula. When you adjust for inflation, that picture gets even more grim, that what is proposed for funding from the state in fiscal 23 is $3 million short of inflation adjusted revenue we received in 2008. So this has been, and this continues to be the real #1 challenge to our ability to adequately fund services. Skipped over it a little bit in taxation, but that is one of the real motivators of the past 15 years of town policy on why we have put such an emphasis on economic development, on rezoning, on investing tens of millions of dollars in sewer construction so that people can rebuild and infill existing property to create new taxable growth, because outside of an override, that's the only way to increase the levy past 2.5%. And before COVID, our new growth was actually getting close to about $1 million a year, which was significantly higher than in the pre-recession years when we lacked sewer. That got knocked back a little bit. Those numbers are closer to 600,000 to 700,000. We're hoping to see some of that come back online. But even if we get back to a place of $900, $1 million a year growth, it's still, it's working against the inertia of that kind of chronic underfunding. So it's a very difficult and protracted challenge.
Connor, can I ask one question before you move on?
Sure.
So the point you made, I want to make sure I understood this. So the UGA funding that is not currently getting to us because of the change in how they're actually calculating it mid-year Where does that live in the meantime? Is that just sitting in a general fund in the Massachusetts state budget so that they can just essentially allocate for whatever they want, or is it
Yes.
pre-allocated? So
Yes, and so that's why MMA specifically made the point that while we have this window of time during this one budget cycle, and everyone here who's worked with institutional budgets, mine is no different. I wouldn't, not trying to be holier than thou here, but it will get marbled in somewhere and it will not come back, right?
That's what I was afraid of. Okay.
So that, and the MMA put that in writing specifically, that is their concern, that we know the Commonwealth has they have problems that financial challenges too. And they're making some wise investments, but rebuilding their stabilization fund. I know that all sound probably past 15 minutes on highly critical on that one area. It is, but there are, the Commonwealth has competing needs and probably from their perspective, inadequate revenue to fund all of it. So if this does not go to UGA, which is probably a shock to everyone here, is not a super headline generating, exciting thing to fund compared to programmatic things or earmarks. It will probably get marbled into state agency funding, and at that point you need to be cutting things to restore it, which is incredibly hard to do. It's a great question. So moving into other categories of revenue, slightly more optimistic here. So local receipts, that's our third largest source of revenue. They're composed of things on the local level that generate revenue, such as motor vehicle excise tax, building permits and fees, liquor licenses, investment income, local meals taxes, which have been growing extremely healthily post first kind of COVID lockdown, and ambulance receipts. They're our third largest source of revenue. They've been grown quite healthily in recent years. They took a bit of a hit during the COVID years because these are much more elastic to economic behavior and demand, unlike property taxes. So in fiscal 21, we beat our budget expectations by a really significant margin, in part because our expectations were quite low. That helped contribute to our good reserve balance. However, the actuals for fiscal 21 are still below pre-COVID levels. So they're moving in the right direction, but we're still not back to where we were before the pandemic. Fiscal 23 budget is projecting an increase of 338,000, so just shy of 5%, for a total revenue in this category of 7.18 million. Reserves. In recognition of the ongoing structural revenue deficit that I just spent some time talking about, created in part by state aid and fixed cost growth, the town has been working to aggressively build its reserves since policies were adopted in 2016 that explicitly and deliberately targeted reducing the amount of one-time money we were leaning on in our operating budgets to fill those structural holes. And in doing so, not easily for many of you who've been at town meetings in the intervening years, but since 2016, we've cut in half the amount of reserves that we're using in your average budget to close that gap, and we've more than tripled the balance of our stabilization fund. Currently, fiscal 23 budget is proposing a level fund of reserves of 1 million, which is what we used last year. Under those policies, which are helping us move away from the practice we don't want to be engaged in of using one-time money in an operating budget, that stipulates that up to half of your free cash could go into a proposed budget for the coming year. Our free cash was certified at 4.6 million. So you could do the math that we actually have quite a bit of headroom if we wanted to make this a very easy budget season, say, well, $1 million deficit, boop, there's $1 million of free cash and we're done. We don't want to do that because that creates a fiscal cliff next year where we're starting out of the gate with $2 million of one-time money that we need to come up with. So for now, this is the limit of what we're proposing on reserves, but we understand that we're going to need to balance that against expenses as we move through this process. Kelly?
I just had a question about, I'm sure you're talking to state legislators about some of the issues our community is facing. I'm just wondering if there's any pushback or anyone saying, you're increasing you're decreasing your use of the reserves and you're increasing the stabilization fund. If you're able to do these things, it's not as dire as you think. Are you hearing any of that, or are they being pretty understanding about the issues?
Our delegation is understanding of the issues, and I have not had anyone push back making those points because at kind of surface glance, they do seem kind of contradictory, right? You're saying you don't have revenue to deal with your operational and service needs, but you're building reserves like it's going out of style. But really, this is kind of a base effect in action. The reason why our reserve growth is so impressive is because it started in such a low place. So where we are now, and that's a great segue into the slide, our reserve balances are healthy. And that is one of, I mean, there's a variety of different rules of thumb you could use, but the town has an established fund balance policy that targets reserves on hand, which is your stabilization of free cash, equaling roughly 10% of your annual operating spend. And this year we are in now is the first time ever that we've reached that goal. So we're not running up the scoreboard. We're just finally getting to where we really ought to be to have sufficient capacity to manage unexpected financial situations. We did lean a little bit on these reserves during the earlier part of COVID. So it's a great question, but no one has pushed back and said, well, you must not need that because your reserves are doing better.
Patrick, you have your hand up?
Mine's pretty quick. The calculation I just did back in napkin is that free cash certified at 4.7 means we're gonna, is this number, free cash 25% into the stabilization fund, is the 4.7 with the existing 23 free cash, or is this yet to be added, the 1.17 to stabilization you're gonna have for this year? That made no sense when I said it out loud, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think
Essentially-
you're asking about, is money being double counted based on when it's moved in between funds, or?
No. I'm saying is the current 4.749 balance, does that have the fiscal 21, or sorry, the fiscal 22 free cash 25% already added to it?
So no, so that balance, that's the certified balance of free cash as of July 1 last summer, which is what we need to certify for the Department of Revenue. Since then, last fall, we moved a quarter of that into the stabilization fund, which is our policy, and some of it has been leaned on for capital in the fall. I think, Wendy, there's somewhere in the twos currently that is not spoken for, left over from that. Is that right? You're muted.
$2,131,157 is
Perfect.
the balance of the 4.7 million.
Awesome. Thanks.
And I just had a quick question on the ability to invest that stabilization fund. Is that investable money, low risk investable, or does it have to sit in cash?
That is a good thing Wendy is here. She's going to answer that.
We do invest that differently than we invest our general operating funds. It's in with Bartholomew Investments, and it definitely does earn a better rate of return than general bank account cash accounts.
But it's not significant, right? I mean, we're not.
No. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm a finance guy, so even at 2 million, you're not going to spin off enough to close the budget. I was just curious if that could be invested.
And there are statutory limitations as to how we can invest the money also. So, we're investing it in a way that we can get the greatest amount of return that we can with minimal risk. We can't invest it, in high risk.
Oh no, yeah, don't put it in crypto, please.
You don't want your town budget in Dogecoin?
My neighbors would love that, but no, I do not.
Did we answer your question?
Yes, sorry, it's bedtime, so I had to go to mute here, but yes, you absolutely did. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you. So we just kind of talked through this. Our reserves are doing better than they have, but this is really just us finally getting to where we need to be. Prevailing revenue trends that I just discussed, coupled with inflation on the expenditure side, is going to make it potentially more likely that we're going to need to lean on these more than we otherwise would like to in the coming years. Another source of revenue that's worth noting, and something that people are probably thinking of, is ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. That is federal funding as part of a bill signed in March 2021. Easton will be receiving and has begun receiving funding through 2 different vehicles, which makes it a little more complex than we would prefer, but we are receiving 1/3 of that directly from the Commonwealth. The other 2/3, however, will flow through Bristol County, basically as an administrator of those federal funds, where we need to spend and then seek reimbursement, which is the opposite of the state funds where they are just deposited into our account. Those funds can be used through the end of calendar year 24. ARPA funds can only be used for specifically outlined purposes as directed by the U.S. Treasury. We're taking great care to make sure that we program these funds in a well thought out manner that best serves the public, meets the spirit and intent of those Treasury guidelines, and similar to using reserves, although ARPA is the most significant federal investment in some ways in local government in a generation, it is one-time money and it does not come back. So we are trying to we are doing some programming, but we are trying to limit that and being very explicit that these are grant funded type positions, because barring other revenue dynamics changing, these funds expire and we don't want to create large fiscal cliffs. We issued a preliminary ARPA plan back in December. It's available online at our website. The operating expenses that are eligible in that area are education, public health, mental health, public safety. We'll make more notes on those in future iterations of the budget, but because it is so kind of large of a program, it's going to continue to have its own programming maintained as well. So that's a very long way of me saying it's not kind of a panacea that we can just swap in and deal with a revenue shortfall in a sustainable, permanent way. So revenue summary, talk through all these here. Bottom line is you're looking at an increase in revenue of 4,059,000, so it's 4.4%. Again, this really nails home. State aid is your second largest revenue category and is projected to grow at barely over 1/3 of what our local receipts will. On the expense side, this is a much shorter part of a presentation at this point in the year. We've requested preliminary budget proposals from our departments with very limited exception. These are level service and level staff. They include an assumed 2% cost of living, and the net there is an increase of 3.81% over the current year. The Easton school budget is currently a placeholder of 4%. These schools have their own budget process that occurs concurrently, but separately from the municipal one. We obviously stay in very close contact with Dr. Cabral and school leadership and try to line these things up and land everyone on the runway at the same time to get into balance. So as is typical, each department will have their budgets as we work with them to refine them, especially where we still have a deficit. Later this spring, there will be a joint hearing as required by charter with the finance committee and the select board. I believe we gave some dates to Patrick. We're looking at later April. Hopefully by then the budget is close to final and balanced, and you'll get to hear directly from every single department head on what they're proposing in their budget for next year. Our expenditure summary, preliminarily, we're looking at 97.5 million. That's an increase of 5.17, 5.6%. That's more than what we're projecting revenue to grow by. As is typical at this point, many of our fixed cost drivers that make budgeting balancing the budget a little tougher are things that we just don't know yet, and we're going to learn as time goes on. Snow and ice deficit. So today was it. We are now in deficit. So thank you, snow. We have a current, I think 100 to 150 assumed as a deficit in the budget. Depending on where we actually end up, that could reduce or grow the deficit. So hopefully this is the last gasp of winter. I don't want to see snow anymore. The outcome of collective bargaining. All union contracts for town and schools expire at the end of this June. Our budgets are overwhelmingly personnel. We are in the people business. So the outcome of those bargaining sessions will have significant material impacts on the budget. Employee health and retiree health insurance rates. Those actually just came out like 40 minutes ago. Wendy had a kind of early copy. She's programming that in. It's looking like the final rates for next year are going to be largely in line with our assumed placeholder that's in the budget of, I think, what, 5%, Wendy? So It's not the worst increase we've seen, but obviously we would like to see that a little more cost effective. We try to get creative. We offer incentive plans where we kind of bonus people out to move from more costly insurance plans to more cost effective ones, and we share the savings. We've netted, a couple $100,000 in savings in these accounts over the years doing that. We're going to continue to try to do things like that. But as time goes on, our ability to kind of get creative and incentivize changes there shrinks. We are still waiting on workers' comp, property, casualty, and liability rates. And then there are regional assessments, such as for Southeastern Regional and Bristol Aggie, which have been growing pretty significantly in recent years that we are waiting on being finalized. So those collectively will have a large impact on the fixed cost drivers in our budget, which therefore will have an impact on the net revenue available to appropriate for our operations and programming. There are some notable increases in fixed costs. Anyone who looked at the line item budget in that memo probably saw debt service and said, whoa, what is that? That's attributable to excluded debt. So that's debt excluded from the levy by voters from the 2019 debt exclusion for the new school. That's moving along wonderfully. And that's a net zero because the revenue is excluded as well. So it nets out. So, and again, you see 1.2 million increase in debt service. Say, what is that? That's primarily attributable to the exempt debt associated with the Blanche Ames Elementary School. There's a comparable increase to the exempt tax levy that pays for it. Other fixed costs that I touched on, benefits and insurance. Regional educational assessments have been growing pretty aggressively. Snow and ice we touched on, and we noted the operational budget. So you end up with 5.6% increase and a preliminary deficit of about 1.1 million. From here, the next steps for us will be continuing to monitor the state budget process and lobby as we have been, and will continue to do for equitable increases to local aid and education funding. Depending on where that goes, could have a huge impact on the budget. Concurrent with that, we'll be reviewing and refining local revenue projections based on the actuals that we collect and assess each quarter. And then whatever is left, we will need to work with our departments, with the schools to refine our operating requests to bring the balance into budget. So that is the first stab at a budget for July. I'm happy to answer any questions, anything that wasn't covered.
I had just a minor one, Connor, on the licensing fees. You're spending some money to kind of bring that program and the web portals up to modern standards. Do you expect a faster click to cash? I called it here in my notes, click to cash cycle with that upgrade.
I click to cash, meaning how long it takes for folks to get in, and yes, it's really focused around quality of life and usability, and we're fully aware of the fact that this platform that once was considered pretty modern for local government is now really dated. So we'll be moving. That contract actually might be on the agenda for the select board to execute Monday night. So we're actively working on that. That will streamline and improve the licensing and permitting process across the board for all of our departments.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that making it easier for people to get in there and get those permits faster, quicker, kind of brings more people to the front than maybe on the sidelines because they've heard the horror stories.
Jay, go ahead.
I noticed the number one target was to lobby for increased state aid from our state reps and the House. What's been our rate of success with that in the past?
Marginal. Because it's not something where, if you're doing a formulaic basis for the calculation of the entire Commonwealth, it's not as if somebody could say, okay, well, Easton gets a special exemption, right? So my listing that as a top priority is not meant to convey that I have confidence that means it will be successful, but it's our job to do our best and raise these concerns and different ways of funding it each year. But this year is different. The dynamic is always challenging, but typically it's not against a backdrop of the state revenue growing by 30% in a couple of years. So hopefully I don't have a tremendous amount of hope that they're going to change the funding formula for Chapter 70. The Mass Municipal Association has been asking for years Not contesting that the formula has different priorities based on demographics and economics. That makes sense. But that the minimum aid number be increased from $30 per student to $100, that would make a material difference to Easton. And frankly, I don't think that's unreasonable. So that's where we're echoing that. And then on the unrestricted aid, I hope we are more likely to be successful there than typical because of that dynamic that is actually different this time.
Okay.
Kelly?
Do we ever work with other communities that are facing similar problems to try and lobby as a group? I'm just wondering if there'd be more power and volume getting in front of there and talking about some of the issues we face as minimum aid communities.
We do, and one of the main ways that we do that is through the trade organization, the Massachusetts Municipal Association. They're the kind of lobbying branch of local government in all of Massachusetts, and each year they work through various committees. I'm on the Massachusetts Fiscal Policy Committee, where we identify shared priorities across the Commonwealth. And this year, the real target and focus of theirs is this revenue, the growing delta in what was once that revenue share. So we do kind of pool our voices collectively through the municipal association, as well as through, to your point, just speaking with colleagues who have very comparable problems in lobbying our delegation. But the Massachusetts Municipal Association is kind of combines and amplifies those, and we in Easton make it a priority to try to make sure that we are specifically at the table. As I said, I'm on the Fiscal Policy Committee. Dottie Fulgenetti, Stephanie Danielson are on a variety of state level policy committees as well, so that we could try to make sure that Easton's concerns are heard regularly.
Jim, you're up.
Hi, Administrator Rating. Thank you for your presentation tonight. My question is kind of quick. You stole a little bit of my thunder with the snow and ice budget. I had a copy of that I was going to present later, but which I will do. Where we're seeing, I guess the question is basically when we see ourselves go over budget on items like snow and ice, and we can anticipate increased operational needs in terms of recent fuel prices, for example. Just for edification, can we anticipate that $1.1 million to expand, or is that something that you think may be absorbable in the current dollars that we have available on the operational budget?
So that's a good question. We are the $1.1 million deficit has I'll get the exact number for you. It's either $100,000 or $150,000 snow and ice deficit assumed in it. Let me find that. Yeah, 150. So right now we are programming this budget with the assumption that we're going to overspend snow and ice by 150,000. We just crossed the budget today, so hopefully, if weather calms down a bit, we won't hit that, and then that will actually help us reduce the budget. To your other question about the impact of fuel and material cost, not only that, the increasing severity of storms we're dealing with. The snow and ice budget not so long ago was only about I think it was a very strange number. I think it was 188,000. I don't know why it was 188, but it was. Wendy probably knows.
88,700.
Sounds about right. And we had Nemo, which was the Snowmageddon, where we basically got like 2 feet of snow every 45 minutes all of February. And our actual snow removal cost was over $1 million that year. And it was so bad, so pervasively around the Commonwealth, that special law was enacted in Massachusetts to amortize your snow and ice debt for 3 years, which you normally can't do. You typically have to pay it the next year. And as part of that, we started increasing that budget by 100,000 every year until we reached, I think now we're 488, or is it more than that now, Wendy? I can find this somewhere.
All right, wait.
We are 493.7.
493.7, yeah.
So we increased it by $300,000 because those types of years, thankfully, we haven't had Nemo level years since, but severe weather has become more common. So we have increased that over time. Snow and ice is unique because very few accounts is deficit spending allowed in municipal government. You can with snow and ice. So when you have the opportunity to deficit spend based on unknowable future events, you have to make a strategic decision on, do you want to encumber $500,000 to be certain you don't have a small deficit and then lose your spending power on that if you only spend $100,000 that year, or not? So that's why we think we found the balance. We usually don't have enormous snow and ice deficits, and we usually spend a healthy amount of it. But we'll definitely be looking at it, I'm sure, going forward, depending on what happens with oil prices and things like that.
The other thing too with the snow and ice budget is that if you raise it up to a particular level and then you have to cut it, if you make that cut, you're not allowed to deficit spend the following year. So that's part of the rationale as to why the budget had been so low for year after year, because once you put it up to that point, you can't cut it and then deficit spend.
Kelly, I was just going to ask if anybody else had one. Go for it.
I was just gonna say, it seems like there's some significant concerns ahead for the town. And I'm just thinking about special populations like elderly or people on fixed income. Is there work going on in the background to really think about how we can help senior citizens continue to pay for these increase in taxes and the increase in goods while, still maintaining the same level of income that they, pretty much stuck with?
Right. Yes. So we have been doing, I think, quite a bit in recent years in this area. We have a department that we reorganize health and community services to try to make sure that we have alignment between what used to be the silos of council on aging, recreation, veterans services, and health. Because those different silos serve a lot of the same populations, right? Somebody might be a veteran who's older, who may have certain medical conditions that may qualify them for a variety of state or federal benefits. Anyone here who has worked with benefits in the United States knows that you need a Ouija board and a cipher and 6 attorneys to navigate these systems, which can make it incredibly difficult for folks who are entitled to benefits to actually receive them. And so we have prioritized staff whose devotion it is to help people with those things. So you have a deputy director of health and community services for finance and veterans affairs. It's Corey Ahonen, used to be the VSO, promoted him. We actually, using ARPA money, have just hired a federal benefits and grants navigator, which is a grant funded position where this person will be forward facing to residents to help connect them to support the existing resource connections we work to do in health and community services, but also specifically tasked with understanding and navigating the new benefits programs that have been authorized by ARPA, because that is a business, it's 1.9 trillion. It's expansive, and we didn't want to just tell existing staff who are already overburdened, hey, figure all that out and make it go. So we will be bringing someone on whose job it is to help people navigate those federally funded assistance programs, including rental and housing assistance. At the same time, this person will be a resource to civic groups, nonprofits, and businesses in Easton to help them connect with grants and other programs authorized by ARPA. They work as part of a much broader team in health and community services, including another recent program that we got off the ground, and would be remiss to not credit Tim for basically doing all the work and making it look good. But we have the MIH, the Community Paramedicine Program, which is taking a member of our fire department who happens to be an RN and assigning them as a public health officer to work between emergency medical services and align that with the proactive planning of public health. Last bit there, specific to the increasing burden on those with fixed income, we are limited in what we can do here. And you're all probably saying, wow, this guy's a lot of problems. He keeps saying we're limited, but we can't do things like structure taxes based on income. We can't do things like structure taxes based on age. It's not allowed under the Massachusetts Constitution. We can't do things like structure property tax rates based on if it's your first home or your 10th. My facial expressions are probably making clear I don't necessarily agree with those, but those are the tools we have. Similarly, many of the programs that exist to assist seniors, individuals with disabilities, and folks who have other income challenges are defined in state law. They are frequently defined in state law with either explicit dollar amounts or borderline regressive standards to qualify, where you need to be in really dire straits to qualify for some exemptions or abatements. So what we've done locally in anticipation of the taxes just growing, because they're going to keep doing that. And also, I should note, our tax rate's lower now than it's been in a very long time. The rate has gone down, value has exploded. So for folks who are in and have that equity, it's not as if this is all a net loss. There is property value generation happening. But for folks who are on fixed income, that's called comfort. And to qualify for so many of these state programs, you need to be in such a tough spot that many people just don't. I think we actually had our assessor's office run an analysis, Wendy. There's certain senior abatement provisions, and we had a single one person qualifying in all of Easton, which what that says is that program does not work, right? So we adopted in 2019, concurrent with a vote to pass the debt exclusion to fund the new school, as frankly a gesture of good faith and us trying to get creative. We adopted the Taxation Aid Committee provision of state law, which has created a local fund where folks can contribute, and a committee of citizens and staff, including those who deal with means testing, can distribute funds directly to residents who are in tough financial spots. One of the benefits of this committee is that they can set standards that are more reasonable. And what they've done is take the affordable housing standard that is used for housing in Massachusetts. So if you make 80% of area mean income, and in Easton, that's a decent salary. It just might mean maybe you're a single parent and you have a couple of kids. And then you qualify. So that we brought in through that program the ability to qualify. However, it's funded through donations. People are obviously generous, and that's wonderful, but that's not a huge amount of sustainable funding. And so one of the components of my ARPA plan is to allocate up to, I think, $250,000 per year into that account during the life of ARPA, so that can provide direct financial assistance to families in Easton. We're working with auditors and attorneys to make sure it checks all the right US Treasury boxes. But that is something that is in the ARPA plan that I'm pretty proud of, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure it checks the boxes it needs to, so we can get that money into the hands of folks who are strapped due to rising fixed costs of just living, but also from taxes.
Robert, you're up.
Sure. Connor and Kelly, that leads into my next question, because Jesus, I just signed up for 3 more years here, and it doesn't sound like we should be. I guess my question here, Connor, is what policies or what plans, proactive plans, do we put in place? This year, we, just like you said, it is a deficit, but it's only going to get worse over the next 2-3 years. It's not going to get better. What policies are you looking at, or what strategies? And I get it, there's a formula for the Chapter 70, but you talked about economic development. What strategies, what policies have we put in place or looking to put in place to incentivize economic development? I mean, I don't know, and that's the question, because it sounds like it's for the next 3 years. If I'm on this finance committee, you're going to be telling me every year that we're in bad shape and we don't have the money and it's deficit and we're not getting the right formula from the state. So what are we doing locally to kind of incentivize economic development to raise a tax base?
Sure. So there's 2 pieces there. First is, I want to clarify, I'm not saying that we're in some kind of irreparable shape that we can't overcome. This is a dynamic we are frankly quite good at managing. And I think the fact that we've managed to mostly maintain services up until COVID, when we had to make pretty draconian cuts, for 15 years in a minimum aid community without an override through 2 global financial crises, is testament to the fact that we've been quite successful. To your question of what are some specifics on the economic development front, we have, working with the select board, the planning board, and of course with voter support, been significantly reforming zoning in key areas of town to allow greater density, greater height, mixed uses, so that people can do more with their property. But you obviously, that only gets you partially a part of the way there. At the same time as we did that, you look at it as a kind of hand in glove approach. You make the zoning more amenable to development, and you build infrastructure that currently, or that formerly was not there, that was a major inhibitor. So all the way back 2013-14, we had Northeastern University come in, a professor of economics, Barry Bluestone, perform what's called an economic development self-assessment test, where they do basically a SWOT analysis with a variety of stakeholder, chambers of commerce, business, local officials, to understand what are the things that are good about your community. And there's a ton in Easton. I'm not trying to say doom and gloom, and I'm sure most of you would agree. It's a great place to go to school and raise family, and a lot of wonderful cultural assets here. But one of the challenges, the number one inhibitor, was lack of sewer. And so since 2013, we have constructed more than $40 million of public wastewater treatment and collection capacity. We had 0 gallons of that 10 years ago, and now we have close to 250,000 gallons of capacity a day. Those projects, however, take years. One of them finished right as we headed into COVID. One of them was constructed during COVID. So that put a bit of a damper on some of that development. So what we're hoping, particularly if you look at Five Corners, we anticipate you're going to start seeing significant development in that area due to the sewer being available and due to those zoning changes. And as I had mentioned, before COVID hit, we had seen our new growth start increasing from after the recession, it dropped to 300,000 or 400,000 a year, and that started growing to about 1 million a year, which is significantly improved. That dipped again in the pandemic, and so we're hoping to see some of that come back. So that's the kind of policy and infrastructure investment aspect. There are other areas that maybe people don't immediately think are economic development, but are critical policy choices that we make to try to continue to make Easton competitive and a place where people want to come and live and have property values maintain their standing, like doing things like building state-of-the-art elementary schools that are going to be, the envy of the region. Those are major investments in ourselves that will continue to incentivize people to want to come and be here. We've seen our population growth be very, very strong the past decade. Housing growth is very strong, and we are trying to move with the times as, if you look at even 5 years ago, the conceptions of what makes sense from an economic development perspective of a mixed use property with some type of brick and mortar retail, COVID fundamentally changed that dynamic. Right? Brick and mortar was already struggling in the Amazon era. And now the focus has really shifted towards experiential and things like that. So we're trying to move with that and keep zoning current with that. So I would say zoning reform, infrastructure investment, and then more minor, or not minor, but important quality of life and process things, as Brian noted before, making sure that we, in an environment where we always could spend more money on roads, making sure we make the right choice, say we need to spend $100,000 to completely redo our permit system so that it is easier and more reliable for people, whether they have an army of engineers or attorneys, or it's just a single person entrepreneur, to get through that process and get to a yes and start spending money. So those are a couple of areas that we're working on development. I'd be happy to go into a lot more detail on what we've done to contain costs as well, but I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. So.
No, that was to my point, especially around zoning.
I really like the school that's the envy of the local area, which I agree with 100%. Nice.
The thing's going to be amazing.
Nice pitch. Nice pitch. Yeah, totally. Does anyone else have any questions on the preliminary piece, or just to sidetrack for a hot second, which is also still sort of in the same realm, since we have both Connor and Wendy on, the handout that I sent out, that PowerPoint presentation that does talk through this. Like I said at the top of the hour, definitely want to put together a time that's going to work for the people that are obviously curious of, like, essentially digging deeper and going through that more in a Q&A. But if there's anything that stands out from those PPT, the template itself, that you want to ask while we have these two titans of their industry here, feel free, throw your hand up and we'll jump in. 3, 2, 1. All right, excellent. Thank you, Connor and Wendy. With that, the only other thing I was going to say, or the only thing I was going to ask you, Connor, before we actually let you guys go, is that department outreach. So for those of you that are relatively newer on the FinCom, the idea to have a more proactive sort of early stage budgetary conversation with departments was floated a few years back. I don't even know, it's like maybe 4 years by now. And the current FinCom administration put this together. Great idea. Like as the FinCom members get to the point where prelims are starting to happen and have a better understanding of how the budgets are put together to really understand how that sausage is made, do we have someone proactively reach out to the various different departments that we're aligned to in that alignment doc that I've shared with all of you? I think I've shared with all of you, but the departments that we are compartmentalized into. And so the long and the short of it is that Connor has given us the go sign, right? We wait for Connor to tell us it's totally okay to reach out so that we don't sort of overwhelm these departments with, you know, random people knocking on their door while they're trying to do these budgets and, you know, being like, hey. So with that, he has given us the go ahead. So all of us can now engage with and reach out to the various different departments that we're aligned to. I'm happy to obviously resend that document so you guys can see which ones you did sign up for. But are there any questions about that, or even just basic process? Like essentially it's the information to get in contact with them, be it via their email addresses and or the department phone numbers are all part of public record. So you can just essentially set up a time, reach out and ask for a time to speak, a time to meet. But if there's any questions about the procedures or process there, I'm happy to dive into it while we have Connor and Wendy here. Or it could be incredibly straightforward and I'm overcomplicated.
Patrick, we had talked before about maybe if there's like a document that people have put together in the past or use to know what questions to ask.
Oh, okay. I don't know if we have anything. I can ask some of the former members as well to see. We had some people that were pretty buttoned up, so they very well might have something that they've actually had like a template to go for. I am in the unenviable position and yet at the same time enviable position that I have the library. So I could call Uma with a list of questions, and by the time the first 5 seconds is over, my questions are gone, and she's trying to convince me to take home a telescope. So it like there's pros and cons to both sides of it.
Isn't Uma? Did Uma already leave? Or I thought she was leaving.
Not yet. I believe she's in at least until next year. End of the year.
I don't think it's next year, but
is it coming up? Oh no.
She's on the agenda for the select board Monday night to.
Is that it?
Say sayonara, but well, no, I don't. That's not her last day. But she.
No, it's not her last day.
Uma will be retiring. So
yeah. She's in the last conversation I had with her. She said she was going to write a book, and I said I'm just going to come to her house from now on and just sit outside her house and ask her for help. But so, Kelly, it's a great question. I don't have one. I can definitely ask around and see if anyone else had one. But in reality, it really is. The long and the short of it is, hi, FinCom. Looking at the budgets, like doing your due diligence of looking at the line item budgets and the increase, asking some questions about what that increase was. In a lot of cases, it's obviously just the natural growth of the way finance works. In other cases, there might have been something that is an outlier. If you see an outlier, asking some additional questions about it. What that comes down to is when we all gather back together post the 2 select board FinCom joint meetings and before the town meeting, if there is anything that's a big sort of outlier, we have the conversation in this context. And then that conversation then obviously informs the rest of the public, if they're watching, you know, the ECAT or whatever it might be, that these are the things that have come up. These are the things that have bubbled up in the scenarios. If that's clear. Okay. Any other questions for our esteemed administrator and accountant before we let them go? Seeing none, Connor, Wendy has.
I'd just like to make a comment that, you know, if before reaching out to the departments, it would, there's a lot of great information in last year's budget document, which is on the website. Read the departmental narratives. They have a lot of good information there that could maybe help just kind of give you an idea of just what's going on in the departments and probably help you ask some of your questions.
It's a great call.
And on the same vein, is actually, I'll find which budget year it is because it covering the cost savings that we've worked on over the years is lengthy. And so we usually refer to it rather than repaste it. But I'll share that with the committee as well. We have budget documents that kind of go through what we've done on solar and energy and the environment, grants and things of that to try to supplement the challenges that we have.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. That's fantastic. All right. So with that, I thank you for your time. Thanks for the presentation and all the details. And we will see you guys around and probably at the next joint meeting.
Thank you for having us. Have a good night.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Do I have to kick you guys out or can you just, no, you can just leave. Okay.
No, they left.
Trying to, but my mouse is being weird.
You just want to hang out. I get
It
it.
stopped working.
You can stay, Wendy. It's fine.
Or you can kick me out. Oh, wait, here it is.
I would
Bye.
never kick you out, Wendy. Are you kidding me? Bye, Wendy.
Good night.
All right, so
Patrick,
Go ahead.
will you recirculate the clusters? I have the old version with the 3 that were unassigned. I was just digging through my emails there.
yeah, you know what? I can pull it up now, and then I'll send it out after this.
That's fine. Thank you.
Can I pull it up now? I don't know if my drive has hated me all day, so maybe not. It doesn't matter. Yes, I will recirculate it right after this, just so you guys have it. Let's see. Okay, back to our agenda. So the outreach piece, I think Kelly's point is actually really apt. I'll see if anyone has that. But the process really is, to Wendy's point, great call. The blurb at the top of the individual departments in the big budget book that we actually get handed out at the town meetings. It's obviously all digital as well, but the blurb at the top really does do a good job of breaking down exactly what's contained therein. DPW is a great example of, obviously they're dealing with a significant amount of information and a significant amount of various different things that call upon them from a budgetary standpoint. Great example of like, you can look at that one for a good read on what one department might be dealing with versus whoever you might be assigned with. It might be a much simpler thing. Okay, so with that, the only other piece that's really here is the workshop scheduling. So a couple of us have had a conversation around having a better grasp of exactly what it is we do here, right? And having a better understanding of like the various different pieces that sort of fill in to make the FinCom. And so that PowerPoint that I'd sent out does a really good job of breaking it down. I had been walked through that, almost seems like 100 years ago at this point, by the then head of the FinCom. And I had no idea where that document went. Dottie actually has it. So Dottie sent it to me and I sent it to you. It's a really good primer, but I also know that, all of us are smarter than one of us in some cases. So if we want to set up a time to have a workshop where we literally sort of go through it, I could literally lead us through the PowerPoint, talk about each individual slide, and then open for questions for things that people do not fully understand. I'm happy to put that together. Shireen had a great idea of sending out, what is it called? What's the thing that you can all just sort of like put your time in? I can't remember what it's called. The doodle? It's a doodle,
Yeah,
right?
the doodle
That
poll,
sounds
yeah.
right, yeah.
You want to say it? I wanted her to say it, but she maybe say it anyway. But so we could send something like that out, and then everybody can sort of put in the people that want to be engaged can put in their time. I would also then at the same time look at someone like Tim, who is incredibly smart and has been doing this for almost as long as I have, literally like I think 8 months less than me. So to put us all in the same room, I think it actually adds value, because then you're going to see the different points of view that those of us that have been doing this for a while have, but also there might be different additional questions that come out of it. So is everyone on board for that? And we can just sort of find a time and set it up. Okay. The question I would ask, do we want to do something like this? So pick a Wednesday that's not within our normal schedule and do something at like a 7 o'clock. Does that seem like more doable, or is, kids schedules and life schedules are obviously all up in the air, but does this seem like a decent time? Because we've carved out chunks of time for this. We could do it on a one-off, like not the second Wednesday, but maybe the third Wednesday, or is Wednesday an awful day every other week?
Fine with me. Sorry, Kelly, didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, a third Wednesday of every month is a leadership meeting for me, but
Okay.
if we start at 7:30, I can jump on at 7:30.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm gonna make a note of that. I'll try for a third or a fourth Wednesday, just depending on what people's availabilities are. And then we'll do 7:30 again. And then, like I said, this won't be too long. It is relatively, Connor's budgetary presentation does a really good job of teeing up exactly what's in that documentation, which is why, genius that he is, he had the suggestion to sort of send it at the same time. That'll give you a breakdown of exactly what we're going to go back through. And then it's essentially a deeper dive into things like cherry sheets and the various other pieces that we could talk through about, like what state aid is and where that overall percentage comes from. So excellent. I will partner with Shireen, who apparently is aware of how to doodle, and I will get her to assist me in sending something out. That last thing we have before I open it for potential comments and or questions is meeting minutes. So you guys saw the note that I had sent that essentially there's something odd about what's going on with the meeting minute certification. So what I did is I went back through and I looked at the agendas that we had that had meeting minutes obviously aligned on them as far as things that we voted on. and I'm slowly peeling back to make sure that we did vote on them and they were, approved and whatnot. So I can give Stacy, our secretary, to the go ahead to say, yes, these are all fine, submit all these. The ones that I sent for this week, those 3 for the 14th, the 20th, and what was the other one? 13th. Those 3 have not been voted on at all because we just haven't brought them up to this association. So I'm going to bring them up for a vote now. As I said in my email, this is not something where if you weren't there, you can't vote on it. This isn't you voting on the accuracy of said minutes. This is you literally just voting to put them into the public coffers so people can come back and refer to them. If you do have an edit, if it's a meeting minute for a meeting that you were part of and you have an edit, you can submit an edit and we can make that change, but just FYI. So roll call vote time and or vote and or seconds. So we can do this in lump. We can ask for all 3. So can I get a motion to vote to include and approve the meeting minutes from 6/14/2021, 10/6/2021, and 9/13/2021?
I make a motion to accept.
That's Diaz. Do I have a second? Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Robert is a second. All right, I'm going to go down the list. DiNardo.
Yes.
Olson.
Olson, yes.
Jenkins.
Jenkins, yes.
DiNapoli.
Napoli, yes.
Diaz.
Diaz, yes.
Famosi.
Famosi is yes for all 3.
Lamb.
Lamb, yes.
And I am a yes. Those are ratified. All right, that's all we got. So my plan for the next time we meet outside of the workshop, I still am, I do not fully understand if we have to position the workshop as something that's like this. It has a town meeting association. I've heard both sides of it. I might just put it as one of these just to be clear, because there's nothing in there that's proprietary information. So we might have a Zoom or whatever for it, but our public Zoom, I should say. But with that, the only other item is the upcoming joint meeting, right? So I sent that out earlier today. For those of you who don't know, the joint meeting is essentially what Connor just went through, but broken out into individual departments. So my example before of Uma getting up and giving an amazing presentation every year, and then every subsequent department head hating the fact that they have to go after her because who could possibly top it? They give the snapshot of exactly what's going on with their budget. So it's spread over 2 nights. So it's not one 7-hour process. And it will be the, what did I say? The 25th and the 27th, I believe. Yeah, April 25th and April 27th. Currently 7 p.m. is the held time. You don't have to give me an answer today. Just put that in your calendar as far as a whole. We do obviously have to have a quorum. Because it's a joint meeting, we will get recognized by the select board. And then that joint association is that same thing. We still have to have at least 5 members on. So just everybody give me a yay or nay if that's possible. Not now, just shoot me whenever you can. We have some time obviously to schedule that, but try to block it off in your calendar now. And then with that, I will take a motion to adjourn if no one else has any other comments or questions.
I did have one question, and if people are interested, I can't go over the snow and ice if there's.
Oh yeah, actually, yeah. No, where are we? Just hit it.
So I guess my one question is real quick. I heard a rumor that the remote meeting has been extended.
Yeah, it has been, yeah.
To July, if that's correct. So I'm assuming that the joint committee meetings will be remote as well.
I didn't get that point. I will ask Elizabeth, the EA for the office, to see if that is the plan. I would assume that is, but I don't know offhand. With the extension, you're right. The Zoom extension has once again gone in till at least July. But it's a good question. I'll ask her tomorrow.
Great. And then on the snow and ice side, I know, like I said, there's a lot of new folks on here, and the snow and ice is always an exciting point just because it changes so often. So hang on one second, I just got to switch screens.
Yep, no problem.
You're on mute there, Tim.
Tim, we lost you. I think when you switched screens, you muted.
How's that? Is that better?
Yep, you're back.
Okay, perfect. So the snow and ice budget was at 493,700. There's been 17 events this year. So basically what it breaks down to is what's the cost and how much is it per inch. So right now they have for this year they were budgeting at $10,816.91 per inch. And they have had 17 events so far, minus this evening. So before this evening, we were at, I think remaining, it was pretty close. It was $2,612. And as you can see, with 2 to 3 inches of snow tonight, we've probably gone over that. So our typical snow to date is 40 inches. This year, we're above that by about 4 inches. So the season starts on December 1st. Typically is like the unofficial start and then ends on the 31st of this month. So we were almost there. So we had 79% of it completed as of last week, but obviously with this week we're going to be going over on that. Director Fields will be going over all of this during his presentation coming up. But the labor costs are about 124,000 so far. Materials 126, contractor costs 166, parts and supplies 57,000. These are all and change. And then the fuel costs were 17,000. But again, with the recent changes in the economic status of fuel, I'm sure we can expect to see that number increase, and then of course increase our per inch costs as well. That being said, they put out 1,681 yards of salt, 14,523 gallons of the it says mag. I don't want to say the wrong frame, so I'll just stick with mag. And then with 34,000 gallons of brine. So very busy year for them as compared to previous years. And of course, unfortunately, this evening kind of put us over the cap. So we'll keep an eye on it over the next few weeks, and hopefully that's the last over budget report that we have to get for the season.
Tim, I will say we haven't met in a while, and we haven't had a huge amount. The one thing that I was dying of curiosity, because I don't have a direct line to it, was to be exactly how many inches and how much we've spent so far. So close yet so far. Thank you, sir. All right, with that, I will take one of you glorious people to do a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
And a second.
Second.
Thank you. DiNardo.
DiNardo, yes.
Olson.
Yes.
There you are. Jenkins.
Jenkins, yes.
DiNapoli.
DiNapoli, yes.
Diaz.
Yes, yes.
Famosi.
Famosi, yes.
Lamb.
Lamb, yes.
And Helen is a yes. We are a wrap. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night. We will talk to you
Thank
soon.
you, folks. Take
Night.
care. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Stay warm.